My name is Arthur Bell, and for 74 years I believed that raising children was an investment you didn't measure in money, but in loyalty. I believed that if you sacrificed quietly, worked honestly, and put your family first, the end of your life would be soft and dignified. I was wrong. I didn't realize it all at once. It happened slowly, politely, wrapped in smiles and concern, the way real betrayals usually are. After my wife Eleanor passed away, the house became too quiet. I still woke up at 6 every morning out of habit, brewed 2 cups of tea, before remembering there was only one of me left. My knees hurt, my hands shook sometimes, but my mind was clear, very clear. Clear enough to notice how often my children started talking about what's best for you now, Dad. Clear enough to hear the way my home stopped being called your house and started being called the property. It was my son Daniel who suggested the old age home first. He said it gently, over dinner, the way you suggest dessert. He talked about safety, nurses, companionship, how I wouldn't be alone anymore. My daughter Claire nodded along, eyes full of rehearsed concern. No one asked me what I wanted. They had already decided. I noticed how quickly the conversation shifted from my health to logistics, what to pack, what to sell, what wasn't necessary anymore. The place they chose was called Willow Creek Residence. The name sounded peaceful. The building was not peeling paint, narrow hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation, a television bolted to the wall that no one really watched. My room was small enough that I could touch the bed and the window at the same time. When the nurse closed the door behind my children after they left me there, the sound wasn't loud, but it echoed longer than anything I'd heard before. The visits slowed almost immediately, first weekly, then monthly, then only on holidays. When I called, there was always a reason they were busy: meetings, school runs, traffic, life. Meanwhile, I watched men sharper than me forget their own names, women cry quietly at night, and nurses learn which residents wouldn't complain no matter how they were treated. I complained once, politely, about my medication being late. It was late again the next day. What my children didn't know was that I had spent 42 years as an accountant. Numbers never lied to me, and I never lied to them. I knew exactly what I owned: the house, the land, the investments, quietly compounding, in places my children had never bothered to ask about. They assumed age meant confusion. They assumed silence meant weakness. That was their first mistake. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching leaves fall into a courtyard no one ever walked through, a thought settled in my mind with unsettling calm. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt clear, clear enough to understand that love given without respect becomes entitlement, clear enough to know that nothing scares greedy people more than losing what they believe is already theirs. The next morning, I asked the front desk for a phone, not to call my children, to call my lawyer, and that was the day everything quietly began to change. My lawyer, Mr. Howard, answered on the second ring. His voice was the same as it had been for years, calm, precise, never surprised. When I told him where I was calling from, there was a pause. Not shock, not pity, just understanding. He didn't ask how I felt. He asked one question only: "Are you thinking clearly?" I smiled for the first time in weeks and told him I had never been clearer in my life. He visited me 2 days later, not at the family table, not in my old living room, in a small visiting room that smelled of stale coffee and old carpet. He placed a folder on the table between us and opened it slowly, as if giving me time to breathe. Inside was my will, the same document my children believed was already written in stone. He reminded me, gently, that as long as my mind was sound, every word in it was still mine to change. We talked for an hour, about assets, about intentions, about consequences. He never once mentioned my children's feelings, only my wishes. When he asked me what I wanted to do, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hesitate. I told him I wanted to change one line, just one, the kind of change most people overlook, because it seems so small. He nodded, slid the paper closer to me, and pointed to the exact sentence that would decide everything. After he left, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I thought about Daniel learning to ride a bike, about Claire sleeping on my chest during thunderstorms. I thought about birthdays I'd worked through, vacations I'd postponed, money I'd quietly set aside so they'd never struggle. I didn't regret any of it, but regret and reward are not the same thing. Weeks passed. My children still didn't know. They called just often enough to feel responsible, just distant enough to stay comfortable. Daniel once mentioned the house casually, asking if I remembered where the spare keys were kept. Claire asked whether I'd signed the facility paperwork yet. I told them both yes. That seemed to relax them. People are kinder when they believe they've already won. At Willow Creek, nothing changed on the surface. Same meals, same routine, same indifferent smiles. But something inside me had shifted. I started observing more closely. Who spoke kindly? Who avoided eye contact? Who listened? I noticed a young nurse named Maria, who always knocked before entering, who remembered how I took my tea, who didn't rush me when I spoke slowly. Small things, important things. One evening, I overheard two staff members talking near the hallway. They mentioned my name, followed by a laugh. One of them said, "His kids dumped him here, he's just waiting to die." I didn't interrupt them. I didn't correct them. I returned to my room and slept better than I had in months. Because by then, the will was already changed. The real change didn't announce itself with drama. It came quietly, the way power always does when it's real. A week after the paperwork was finalized, Mr. Howard called me again, just to confirm everything was filed and witnessed properly. He reminded me that no one needed to know. Not yet. Especially not the people who thought time itself was on their side. I thanked him and hung up, feeling lighter than I had in years. Something curious happens when people believe you are finished. They stop performing. Masks slip. Truth leaks out in careless sentences and impatient sighs. Daniel's next visit lasted less than 10 minutes. He stood instead of sitting, glanced at his watch twice, and talked about renovations he was planning someday for my house. Claire brought her children once, let them run around the courtyard, and spent most of the visit scrolling on her phone. When they left, neither of them hugged me. They waved from the doorway, already halfway gone. I began keeping notes. Nothing dramatic. Just dates, phrases, small moments. Who came, who didn't, what was said, what wasn't. Old habits from a lifetime of balancing books. People forget that accountants don't just count money. We count patterns. And the pattern was clear. I was no longer a father. I was a placeholder, a formality waiting to expire. Maria noticed the notebook one afternoon and asked, gently, what I was writing. I told her I was keeping track of my days. She smiled and said that was a good idea. Most people forget theirs, she said. I asked her how long she'd worked here. She said 2 years. Long enough to know who would be visited, and who wouldn't. Long enough to know that loneliness wasn't the worst part. Being discarded was. The first real test came when I fell in the hallway. Nothing serious. A bruised hip, a shaken pride. But it gave my children an excuse to sound concerned without being present. Daniel called and asked if I needed anything. I told him no. Claire texted a heart emoji. Neither came. Maria sat with me until the pain eased, brought me soup that night, even though it wasn't her shift. I thanked her. She shrugged and said someone should. As winter approached, the administrator called me into her office. She spoke in that slow, careful tone reserved for people assumed to be fragile. She suggested that my children might want to review my care plan, possibly upgrade rooms, possibly discuss long-term arrangements. I told her my arrangements were already handled. She looked surprised, then curious, then cautious. People get very polite when they realize they may have misjudged someone. I wrote one more letter that week, not to my children, to the facility itself, a simple notice, stating that certain expenses would be covered directly, that specific staff members were to be prioritized in any future staffing changes. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. Money has a way of clarifying conversations. By the time spring arrived, Willow Creek treated me differently, not better, differently. Doors opened faster. Requests were handled promptly. The laughter in the hallway stopped when I passed. I said nothing. I only watched, and all the while my children continued living their lives, confident, unbothered, already spending what they believed was theirs. They had no idea how expensive that confidence was about to become. The invitation arrived in early May. Daniel called, unusually cheerful, and said they were planning a small family dinner. Nothing fancy, just a chance to reconnect. He said it had been too long. Claire chimed in on speakerphone, agreeing a little too quickly, mentioning how the kids missed their grandfather. I told them I'd be happy to come, that it would be nice to see everyone together again. There was a brief silence after I agreed, the kind that comes when a plan finally locks into place. They picked me up that evening in Daniel's car. It was clean, new, paid for with a loan he'd once asked me to co-sign. As we drove, he talked about work, about rising costs, about how hard everything had become lately. Claire added comments about school fees, groceries, how nothing was the way it used to be. I listened. I always listened. Old habits die slowly. The house looked different. Fresh paint, new furniture, changes I hadn't approved but recognized. My house, or what used to be called mine. They helped me inside like I might shatter if handled too roughly. Dinner was warm, familiar, carefully nostalgic. They laughed at old stories, reminded me of better times, spoke softly, kindly, the way people do when they want something without asking for it outright. Halfway through dessert, Daniel finally said it. He leaned back, folded his hands and said they'd been thinking about the future, about planning, about making things easier for everyone. Claire reached for my hand and squeezed it, eyes glossy. She mentioned paperwork, just formalities, updates, nothing urgent, but important. They both watched my face closely, searching for confusion, for fear, for weakness. I nodded slowly. I told them I'd already taken care of my affairs, that everything was settled. Their shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Claire smiled. Daniel exhaled. Relief spread across the table like warmth. They assumed settled meant signed, sealed, predictable. They assumed it meant them. Daniel asked casually who the executor was. I told him it was Mr. Howard.
The same lawyer I'd used for years. He nodded, satisfied. Claire asked if I'd remembered to include everyone. I smiled and said yes. That answer seemed to please her most of all. When it was time to leave, Daniel walked me to the door. He hugged me then, firm and quick, like a transaction. Claire kissed my cheek and told me to rest, told me everything would be okay now. As they drove me back to Willow Creek, neither of them noticed how calm I was, how light. 2 weeks later, I asked Mr. Howard to schedule the reading, not because it was necessary, because it was instructive. The day of the reading, my children arrived early, dressed well, polite, confident. They sat across from me at the long table in Mr. Howard's office, whispering occasionally, smiling at one another like co-owners waiting on paperwork. Claire brought a folder. Daniel brought expectations. I brought nothing but myself. Mr. Howard cleared his throat and began. He read the usual things first. Final arrangements, small personal items, sentimental objects. My watch to Daniel, Eleanor's jewelry to Claire. They smiled, nodded, already counting ahead. Then he reached the line, the one they thought they knew by heart, the one they had never actually read. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and read it aloud. I didn't watch the paper. I watched my children. That's when the room finally went quiet. Mr. Howard's voice stayed steady as he continued reading, but the air in the room changed so suddenly it felt heavier to breathe. The line was simple, almost harmless in wording. It stated that all remaining assets, including the house, land, investments, and liquid funds, were to be placed into a private trust, not for my children, not for their children, for the long-term care, dignity, and well-being of myself, followed by charitable allocation at the trustee's discretion. The trustee, named clearly and unmistakably, was not Daniel, it was not Claire, it was Maria. At first neither of them reacted. Their minds were still catching up, trying to process what they thought they'd heard versus what was actually said. Daniel frowned slightly, leaning forward as if proximity might correct the mistake. Claire's smile froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She looked from the paper to me, then back to Mr. Howard, waiting for clarification that didn't come. Daniel laughed once, short and uncertain. He said there must be an error. He said maybe an older draft had been read by mistake. Mr. Howard looked up then, calm and unbothered, and explained that this was the most recent, legally binding version of the will, signed, witnessed, and verified. He added that Arthur Bell was of sound mind at the time of signing, exceptionally sound, in fact. That last part was unnecessary, but I appreciated it. Claire's voice cracked when she spoke. She asked why, not angrily at first, confused, hurt. She asked what she had done wrong. Daniel's confusion turned to irritation edging toward panic. He asked about the house, about the investments, about what he called the family future. I let them speak. I let the silence between their questions stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I spoke. I told them I hadn't changed my will out of spite. I hadn't done it to punish them. I had done it because they had already made their choice. They had chosen convenience over care, assumptions over respect. They had decided my life was something to be managed cheaply and from a distance. I reminded them quietly that they were the ones who placed me in Willow Creek and stopped coming, that they were the ones who talked about my house as if I were already gone, that I had simply adjusted my plans to match their behavior. Daniel stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He said this was manipulation. He said I had been influenced. He said someone had taken advantage of me. His eyes flicked toward Maria's name on the page like it burned. Mr. Howard interrupted then, informing him that any accusations of undue influence would require evidence, medical evaluations, and court proceedings that would take years. Years during which the trust would remain active and untouched. Daniel sat back down slowly. Claire cried, real tears this time. She said she loved me. She said she never meant for things to go this way. I told her I believed she loved the idea of me. I told her love that only exists when it's easy isn't love at all. It's comfort, and comfort disappears the moment it costs something. The meeting ended shortly after. There was nothing left to argue. My children left separately. Daniel without a goodbye. Claire with one last look that held regret too late to be useful. Maria didn't attend the reading. She didn't need to. She found out later that evening when Mr. Howard called her personally. She came to see me afterward, eyes wide, hands trembling, asking if there had been a mistake. I told her there hadn't been. Life after that didn't become dramatic. It became quiet in a different way. Willow Creek improved, slowly, noticeably. Staff turnover dropped. Supplies arrived on time. Residents were treated with a little more patience, not because I demanded it, but because accountability now existed. Maria never changed how she treated me. That's how I knew I'd chosen correctly. My children called once more, separately, both careful, both polite, both distant. I kept the calls short. I didn't owe them explanations anymore. I had already given them a lifetime of those. I am 81 now. I still wake up early. I still drink my tea slowly. I sit by the window and watch the seasons change. I am not rich in the way my children once imagined, but I am wealthy in something they never understood. Peace, dignity, control. All it took was changing one line, and finally choosing myself. There is one thing people rarely tell you about endings. They don't arrive with music or announcements. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary days. After the will reading, nothing exploded. No lawsuits came. No dramatic apologies. Life simply revealed who everyone really was. Daniel stopped calling altogether. At first I checked the phone out of habit, then out of curiosity, and finally not at all. Claire sent a long message weeks later, full of explanations, justifications and memories she hoped would soften me. I read it once, slowly, and deleted it. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Some words arrived too late to change anything. Maria never asked for more than she was given. She never treated me like a benefactor, or a secret weapon. She treated me the same way she always had, with patience, dignity and honesty. That consistency mattered more to me than blood ever had. When the trust formally took effect, she insisted on transparency, oversight and distance where needed. That's how I knew the money was safe. Greed announces itself. Integrity doesn't. Willow Creek changed, but not overnight. Systems rarely do. But the smallest things improved first. Food arrived warm. Lights were fixed without reminders. Residents were spoken to like people, not problems. I watched men who had been ignored for years sit a little straighter. I watched women laugh again, softly at first, then without apology. I never told them why things were better. Some truths are kinder when left unexplained. On my 82nd birthday, Maria brought me tea and a slice of cake. No candles, no singing, just presence. She asked me once, carefully, if I ever regretted my decision. I thought about that longer than I expected to. Regret is a strange thing. It usually belongs to the people who expected something for nothing. I told her no. What I regretted was waiting so long to accept what had already been shown to me. I am not lonely. That surprises people. Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people who have already left you emotionally. I know where I stand now. That knowledge is steadying, comforting, powerful. Sometimes new residents arrive with their families, hopeful, anxious, full of promises. I recognize the tone. I recognize the smiles. I don't interfere. Everyone learns in their own time. But when they sit beside me later, confused by silence that used to be filled with voices, I listen. That is the one thing I still give freely. If there is a lesson in my story, it isn't about money or wills or revenge. It's about ownership of your time, your dignity, your final chapters. The moment you allow others to decide when you are finished is the moment you truly are. I was placed in a cheap old age home because my life had been reduced to a line item. I changed one line, and with it I reclaimed everything that mattered. Not my house, not my money, my ending. And this is where my story ends. Not with anger, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with understanding. The kind that comes only after everything unnecessary has fallen away. I sit by the same window each morning, sunlight resting on the floor, tea warming my hands. I am older now, slower in body, but lighter in spirit than I have been in decades. My children are living their lives. I no longer follow them. I wish them no harm, and I owe them nothing. What was meant to be given freely was given. What was taken for granted was withdrawn. That balance feels fair. Willow Creek is no longer just a place people are sent to wait. It has become a place where people are seen, where names are remembered, where dignity is not considered a luxury. I didn't change the world. I changed my corner of it, and sometimes that is enough. People think revenge must be loud to be satisfying. They're wrong. The most powerful kind of revenge is living peacefully, on your own terms, after others assumed you were finished. It's choosing where your story ends when others tried to write it for you. They put me in a cheap old age home because they thought my life was over. I changed one line in my will to remind them and myself that it wasn't. And if you remember anything from this story, remember this. Never give anyone the power to decide your worth, your dignity or your ending. Because the moment you take that power back, everything changes.